Let's take a look around the finished build. Now, probably my biggest concern with this case, this being the first time I've built into it, and seeing the size of the case, was that I was going to end up with some extremely long tube runs and that the loop was going to end up messy, kind of going backwards and forwards across the case. But it's actually worked out quite well. It's, fairly short. There is a couple of long runs, particularly that top one. But I've also managed to get a lot of symmetry through the loop, and that's just due to there being so many options with this case. There's a lot you can do for the loop to create whatever loop you want. So bringing that lower radiator up into the main compartment really helped. Also, the through panel mods, as always, really helped. There are a few challenges I had with the case. Probably the worst one is the top radiator needs to be offset towards the front, even in a case of this size. And it's something that you would expect to have been considered. You'd be fine with a 120mm wide radiator, but with this 420mm radiator at the top, there's only a 10mm gap before it's touching the motherboard, so it was very difficult to install the EPS and ATX cables. I almost had to remove the radiator to install them. I actually had to undo the drop-in radiator mount at the top and push it up a couple of millimeters to be able to get the connectors through. Now, I could have pulled the connectors off the cables, but yeah, it's really not something that you should have to struggle with in a case of this size. I would also like to see a bigger opening behind the reservoir plate, because there's not quite enough room to do the through panel mods if you want to, like to bring the drainage and fill ports through. But that's not such a big deal. And the radiator mounts are kind of difficult to deal with. Like on this mid plate here, the radiator mount doesn't come all the way across. It stops back here. So I had to install some washers to keep the fan sitting flat on this end. And then on this end, the stop fittings on the other side of the radiator, because this is a quad port radiator. Actually, it has 6 ports, it has ports on the ends as well. And it even has another port on this end for drainage. But the stop fittings stick out on the other side, and so they touch the radiator mount because it comes in so narrow. So I had to make some cuts in the case just for the stop fittings to fit, so that I could mount that radiator onto the lower compartment top plate there. The lighting for this build, I'm still going to install 2 RGB LED strips, probably just one at the top, one at the bottom, because we do have a farb work in this build. But for me, there's enough lighting as it is right now. We have the case lighting, which is easier to see from around the back because it goes all the way up that back side. But I really like it. It's RGB. You can change the colors from a dial on the front, and you get that kind of internal glow as well. And then we have all of the component lighting, which these days for me is just more than enough. So we have, this is all RGB, the motherboard lighting, the CPU and GPU water blocks. For the cables, as always, MDPCX sleeve. This time I've done Italian red, titanium grey and carbon BTI. For the coolant, we have Mayhem's Pastel Red and Mayhem's Pastel Pure Black. Now, if you want the blackest coolant possible, go for the X1 Oil Black. You would expect the Pastel Pure Black to be blacker, but that's not the case. The Oil Black is the blackest. Now, this off camera does appear very, very black. On camera, for some reason, it always appears a little bit purple. But yeah, definitely in real life, it matches up with the black on the case a lot better. So let's take a look at these loops. So for the GPU loop, we go straight out the back. So I've used through panel fittings. It's really the only fitting to use every time you go through a panel. I've used a lot of them here. So coming through the reservoir panel, then into a 90-degree single mini D-plug, connecting the flow sensor, and then another 90-degree single going back through. Into the GPU with a 90-degree single rotary, out with another one, directly into the radiator, out with a 90-degree single rotary, and then back into the pump top with another 90-degree single rotary. So very basic, simple loop. For the size of this case, I was really happy with the amount of fittings that I needed to use, quite minimal. The CPU loop, again, out the back, same as the GPU loop, very similar configuration. Coming through the back, we have a 90-degree single, Then connecting the flow sensor, we have a mini D-plug and then a 90-degree single. And then we come back through with a 30mm extension, 90-degree dual rotary into the CPU water block. And I've turned the CPU water block upside down to get the ports where I want them. The middle port, which is the inlet port, it is a directional water block closer to this side where I'm coming in from. Then here I've used a 90-degree single, medium telescopic fitting, 15mm extension and a 90-degree single. They were just too close together to use tube. It would have been a tiny little piece. Then into the top radiator with a 90-degree dual. Back out with a 90-degree single and a 90-degree dual. That's to get an offset up closer to the top radiator so that I could go across the top of that other tube. And then a 90-degree dual. So another fairly simple loop. So I'm quite impressed with the cable management and cable routing for this case. It was something that I had a lot of fun with for this build. First of all, there's so much space that it just makes it incredibly easy, but something that I've always liked is an offset panel on this side. And you can see that they've implemented an offset panel in such a way where it's really multi-purpose. And with my mods, I've made it even more multi-purpose. But this acts as a shroud for all of the cables that come off the side of the motherboard. So the 24-pin, the SATA data, some of the front panel cables, USB 3, even the PCIe if you want to run them out to the side like I did here. And in this build, this was the only way to run them with one GPU and so much empty space underneath it. It would have looked strange to run them vertically. But also none of the holes were actually lined up with the PCIe cables. So that would have required mods if I wanted to run them vertically. There are so many holes, like this one here, this one, there's another one underneath, but none of them line up. So this panel, as well as having the pump res combos, the fill ports, the drainage system for the CPU, the GPU drainage system I moved around the front. I often like to put them both together for symmetry and so that they're easy to access in one place, but it's more important to have a drainage system that works as well as possible. So putting it at the lowest point is the most important thing. And both of these drainage systems are right at the lowest point, so they're going to be extremely effective. And I tested the GPU drainage system and it drains pretty much 95% of the coolant. We also have the Aquero back here, the FARB work. We have a splitter here for the Aquabus. We have the flow sensors, which I think is a nice little extra. I don't normally use them, but considering for all of the customer builds that I do, I use 8064 to put all of the system stats on the desktop. So having the flow as well is really a nice extra, mainly when you have RPM curves set up for the pumps, so you can see the flow increasing and decreasing. And you know, I also have, well, basically everything there, like all of the RPMs for the fans, the pumps, all of the temperatures, coolant temperatures. That's something else these do. They also have the coolant temps, alarm, another temperature sensor input. So they're a very useful component. It's always difficult to find a place for flow sensors because they're a bit big and bulky, so this turned out to be a perfect position for them. There are so many front panel cables on this case because it's designed to fit 2 systems. So there's just an enormous bundle at the front there, and very few of them can actually be sleeved just because of the shapes and sizes of the connectors. So they were just a huge mess at the beginning and quite difficult to manage. You have a lot of space in this lower section down here. So Phanteks gives you 2 pump mounts. You also have the access to all of the drives. So we've only installed 1 hard drive there.